Thank you for joining us to examine the history of mass extinction and possibly the future of mass extinction. Please take a moment now to do the usual and turn off your cell phones and devices. Also, if you need to leave before the program is over, please exit through the door, up the stairs, and out the rear of the theater to minimize interruptions. A cursory internet search of the term mass extinction returns alarming results. Over 5 million alarming results. The message which blasts from just page 1 of a Google search is unequivocal. Some examples are: Earth is on the brink of a 6th mass extinction, scientists say. Frog mass extinction is on the horizon. Without a doubt, a 6th mass extinction event is here. And finally, the 6th mass extinction event is underway, and we're the cause. So tonight, we're hoping to take a little less alarmist, a little more contemplative, but no doubt cautionary view at this mass extinction that is underway. We will watch the film Mass Extinction, Life at the Brink, which examines these ideas, and we'll hear from 2 prominent scholars of the topic who will offer historical context to the phenomenon of mass extinction, as well as assess where we stand and the steps we can take to slow the process. Jonathan Payne is a Stanford geologist who is featured in the film, and Sarah Holt is the producer, director, and writer of the film we're about to see. First, Jonathan will offer an intro detailing some of his work as well as some background to the science that we'll see in the film. We'll watch the movie, and then Sarah will join Jonathan on stage to have a conversation. Then finally, the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Payne to the stage.
Hi, everyone. I cannot see you. I'm sure you can see me. And here are my slides. So the welcome was right on target. What I wanted to start with was the fact that there is, as we now already know, much talk in the media about the topic of mass extinction and the possibility that the Earth is undergoing mass extinction at the present time. In particular, this extinction is often referred to as the 6th extinction. The first mention that I came across was the title of Richard Leakey and Roger Lewin's book from the 1990s. There's a recent book by Elizabeth Colbert from the past year. This has made it into the culture not just around the reporting of biodiversity and conservation, but in fact it is now the title of a novel, as well as a rock band. So the concept of the 6th extinction is clearly permeating our culture. What I wanted to do ahead of the film was to give you a little bit of historical background so that you understand exactly where this term comes from. So the first scientist to talk seriously about the idea of extinction was Georges Cuvier. And Cuvier essentially proposed the idea of extinction by taking careful anatomical examination of fossil mammals, especially mastodons, and by comparing them to known living species, showing that morphologically they were distinct from any species alive on Earth today, or in the early 1800s in this case. And Cuvier therefore argued that these must be species that are actually extinct from the planet today. Further, he realized that there were actually a number of fossil mammals that are present in relatively young sedimentary rocks, but are not alive on the planet. And so he proposed that, in fact, not just one, but many species went extinct. And in contemplating this idea of how extinction might work, said all these facts, consistent among themselves and not opposed by any report, seem to me to prove the existence of a world previous to ours destroyed by some kind of catastrophe. And so this is really, as far as I can see, the first scientific argument for a mass extinction as a catastrophe. Cuvier, of course, is writing prior to Darwin and the origin and the publication of The Origin of Species. So he's not thinking about evolution in the way that we think about evolution today, but he understands that there's biodiversity on the planet and that biodiversity may have been lost catastrophically. Interestingly, the contrary line of thought here largely comes from Charles Darwin himself. And so as Darwin was arguing for how species are created generation by generation through natural selection on small variations in morphology, he viewed extinction as a similar kind of gradual process and ended up arguing in The Origin of Species that as species are produced and exterminated by slowly acting and still existing causes, and not by miraculous acts of creation and by catastrophes. And so we can see that he's extending this logic not just to the creation of species, but to their extinction as well. And so his view, and a contrary view to the interpretation of mass extinctions for many years, has been that mass extinctions may be an artifact of the fossil record that represent missing time. And so if we miss a lot of time, a lot of extinctions may occur just because they accumulate gradually and not because of any catastrophe. And of course, if we think back to Cuvier's understanding of what a geological catastrophe might be was not quite the same as ours today. And so you imagine things like mountain ranges being built on timescales of a human lifetime or shorter. And so these kinds of things Darwin viewed as not being realistic interpretations of the rock record, and argued back against them as well as against the catastrophic extinction of species. So how we study mass extinctions today really comes into how we study the history of biodiversity. And this effort really started in the 1930s, so we're moving ahead nearly a century from the work of Cuvier and Darwin. And what happens when we study biodiversity in the fossil record is we have a geological timescale. And you can see that timescale here running from left to right across the bottom of this graph. And for any given species, or for any given Linnaean higher taxon, so a genus or a family, we can go through all known fossil occurrences and try to find the first occurrence of that species or genus and the last occurrence of that species or genus. And essentially all we need to do is assume that between that first occurrence and last occurrence, the species was alive somewhere on the planet. And so by finding these stratigraphic ranges, which are the horizontal blue lines that you see, we can then go through and add up how many species were alive at any given point in geological time and develop what we might call a diversity curve. Right? So here on the bottom, we're now plotting biodiversity as a function of geological time. Okay, so efforts to do this actually started also in the 1860s, and this is work of John Phillips, who, using the fossil record of Great Britain, developed a schematic curve for what he believed the fossil diversity of the British fossil record to be, running from the Paleozoic. So the beginning of the Paleozoic over on the left would have been about 550 million years ago, and running up to the end of the Cenozoic, which would be the present day. Phillips, of course, we did not have a radiometric timescale yet, so Phillips didn't know how much time was involved in this. But in fact, if you look at the relative durations of the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic, based on the thicknesses of rocks that he was looking at, they end up actually being quite close to the relative durations that we know now from radiometric dating of geological materials. The next really rigorous attempt to quantify diversity in the fossil record came in the 1960s. And this is a graph from work by Jim Valentine in 1969 showing the number of animal families in the marine fossil record plotted as a function of geological time. The key thing to see here is this is the first time that we really have quantitative data. You can see that the lines are actually broken up into segments, and those segments represent the intervals of geological time that Valentine was able to resolve. So in this case, his time intervals are about 30 million years long. And that relates to how well he can divide up time in rocks all the way around the world. And so we can do better if we stay in a small geographic area. But if we want to know about global diversity, our time resolution is necessarily a bit lower. And so here in this plot, we can see that animal diversity started low over on the left in the Cambrian and ends up high at the present day in the Cenozoic. And there's at least one interval of a fairly substantial decline in biodiversity. If we look over here between the Cretaceous and the Cenozoic, this is where the extinction of the dinosaurs would fall. And we can see that there's not any obvious decline in biodiversity across that boundary. And that really has to do with these limits of time resolution, that the time interval after the end Cretaceous extinction is so long that it captures a lot of the recovery, and therefore we don't actually see a decline in biodiversity. Going forward a decade from Valentine's work, Jack Sepkoski, pictured here on the bottom, in collaboration with his University of Chicago colleague David Raup, pictured here on the top, recompiled biodiversity data, and they did so at a finer level of stratigraphic resolution using about 5 to 7 million year time intervals instead of intervals that were more in the 20 to 30 million year window. And so for the first time, they were actually able to resolve several dramatic and rapid drops in biodiversity over geological time. And those are numbered here, 1 through 5. I think you can imagine now where this term sixth extinction comes from. They argued statistically that there are 5 extinction events that fall out relative to what's going on in the background. And so the key thing to remember here is that biodiversity over time reflects not just extinction, but also origination. And so what they wanted to do then was to look specifically at extinction. How much of the decline in diversity reflects more than usual extinction as opposed to less than usual origination. And so in this same paper from 1982, they created a graph that showed the rate of loss of animal families across geological time, so going from 600 million years ago or so up to the present day. And what they argued is that from a statistical standpoint, there is a population of events that encompass most geological time intervals, what we call stages or ages. And those they defined as background extinctions. So this, from a statistical standpoint, is anything within 2 standard deviations of the best fit regression line. If you don't want to think about statistics, these are just where most of the data fall. And then what they said is, after we look at where most of the data fall, there are a number of events that fall very far above that background rate. And so they term those mass extinctions. And so they were making here not just a sort of observation, but a real statistical argument that there are 5 intervals of geological time, one at the end of the Devonian here, the Ashgillian, a few intervals that they lumped together in the late Devonian, the Javedian, Fronian, and Fomenian stages, 2 that they lumped together in the end of the Permian, the Guadalupian and Jolfian on this. And so this will be one of the extinctions that we talk about in the film, the end Permian mass extinction. An extinction at the end of the Triassic period, the Norian, and then an extinction at the end of the Maastrichtian stage. This is the end Cretaceous extinction, which eliminates the dinosaurs, among many other organisms. And so the 2 that we'll talk about today are the Maastrichtian and the end Permian. And then they were doing some other things. Occasionally in the fossil record, there are intervals where we get unusually good preservation of fossils, which can drive diversity up. And so these little X's that you see sticking up into the mass extinction realm here back in the Cambrian and one here up in the Jurassic are related to what would happen if we include all of these very unusual fossil deposits that record soft bodies as opposed to the skeletons that are more typical of the fossil record. Okay, so that's where the sixth extinction idea comes from. These are the data that underlie it. And I just wanted to mention very briefly before we start the film one other thing, which is after mass extinction, what happens with recovery? And so recovery occurs on a number of different timescales in regional disturbances. Here's a satellite image of Mount St. Helens from 1974. I guess much of the audience can guess what's going to come next, which is 1980. After the eruption of Mount St. Helens, we can see this large area of devastation near the mountain. Come back in 2011, and the forests are regrowing and the ecosystems are back in business. So decades are the timescales that it takes to recover from a regional disturbance under most circumstances. Climate change is a bit different. When we put a lot of carbon into the atmosphere and cause climate to warm, the geological processes that remove carbon from the atmosphere and cause climate to cool again run on a slower clock. And so here is a graph of the best studied warming event in the geological record. This is the warming event at the end of the Paleocene, so about 55 million years ago. And these are data. These are measurements of the ratio of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 in fossils. The key thing is that these are a proxy for temperature. So you can read a temperature axis over on the right. And here we can see this rapid warming event at 55, or just a little less than 55 million years ago. And you can see that over an interval of 100 to 200,000 years, temperatures come back to where they were. And that's the process of the geological removal of the carbon, putting it back into the geological record as limestone and as organic matter. So that's the timescale climate takes to recover. If we go and look at biodiversity, we can see that after these mass extinction events, these time intervals are 5 million years long. And so for these mass extinction events to show up as dips in biodiversity, that means that the recovery of biodiversity is on a timescale of millions of years, generally 5 to 10 million years. So biotic recovery, the recovery of biodiversity and ecosystem function, is much slower than the recovery of climate after very large disturbances. Finally, the thing I wanted to leave you with is, here's our biodiversity curve, right? This is the history of animal life over the last 600 million years. It's a tiny fraction of Earth history, right? Building up a planet that is habitable for animals takes a much longer time. It takes billions of years. And so if we look at the formation of the Earth 4.56 billion years ago, for the first half of Earth history, we didn't even have oxygen in the atmosphere. And oxygen shows up at about 2.35 billion years ago. And oxygen levels that would be breathable for almost any animal on the planet really probably don't show up until very soon before the actual appearance of animals in the fossil record, about 600 or 700 million years ago. And so if we think about recovery from a disaster beyond what we've experienced in the history of animal life, the timescale of recovery would likely be billions of years if we want to think about the recovery of animals. So that's a little bit of background, which I hope will make seeing this film even more informative for you. So with that, I will leave you with the film.
There's a mass extinction occurring on the planet today.
There has never been anything like this in human history. You know, humans have never seen anything like this.
In many ways, it's the biggest crisis since we came out of our caves 10,000 years ago, no less.
Our estimates of how many will be lost if we're on this path are pretty good, and they're really big numbers.
We may well lose half of the world's biological diversity.
When we wipe out populations and species of other organisms, we're sawing off the limb that we're sitting on.
During the last 50 years, while I've been involved in conservation, I've noticed that the amount of money going into conservation has increased 5 times over. And the amount of scientific understanding we've got has increased 5 times over. The number of citizens involved in this game increased 5 times over. And yet, our cause is still going down the tubes. So the mass extinction is gathering pace more than ever. So what's going wrong? We need to attack the root causes of our problems.
When you think about it, what does our culture offer us in the way of wisdom to deal with any kind of difficulty? Our cultural wisdom is, buy this, it'll make you happy.
The most optimistic scenario is that by mid-century, there will be 9 billion of us, and all of those people want to live as well as we do in the West.
Preventing extinction is going to be a big challenge for human society, but it's certainly one that we're capable of doing.
This is something that we have to do now. It's not something that we can postpone to our children or our grandchildren. It's up to us. This is a responsibility that our generation has uniquely.
Well, I just wanted to thank everybody tonight for coming and to thank the museum for having the screening. It's always a little bit of a downer at the end of this film, but I hope people will really pay attention to, I think, Tony Barnofsky's last bite, that there still is this window of opportunity, and we have the ability to actually reverse a lot of the things that are happening right now.
So as you were putting the film together, how does one link the catastrophes we see in the geological record with the modern without, putting us on this course to disaster? How do you go about thinking about the storytelling aspect of that? Did you feel like you needed to end on a positive note?
You know, I think films have this kind of organic way of evolving, and they almost feel like two separate films. The very first film was, the very first part of the film was really an effort to kind of take on the whole issue of denialism. And we thought if we showed people the scientific process and the real data and the evidence and how you actually figure out what happened millions of years ago, even though there are no witnesses, that we would begin to build a case for these geological events occurring. And by the time we got to the last act, it was really the hardest because the broadcaster wanted to hit it hard and make it very sensational. Our funder, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, wanted careful science. And I think somehow Tony Bernofsky really struck a balance that everyone could live with. It wasn't like the sky was falling, but he also put enough urgency to the situation, I think, that it made the film moving.
And so, I guess one of the big challenges I see, as a scientist working on this is how I take what seems like very mundane activity actually most of the time and turn that into something watchable for 45 minutes. How challenging do you find that when, do scientists come naturally to turning this into tellable material? Or
it varies.
Yeah.
And, I went with my husband. I brought him on the shoot to China, and we were at the extinction boundary, and his reaction was we came halfway around the world to film muddy rocks. And initially, they dug out this boundary, and then they'll say to you, that's where one world ended and the other began. And you knew that if a scientist wasn't there helping you see it, you would just walk by. But when you really begin to look at the fossils they were finding and look at the extinction boundaries, but I noticed by the end of the shoots, like in the Badlands, we started off staring up at the vistas, and by the end of the shoot, everyone was staring at the ground because there were so many fossils. But as you said when I came out to film with you, that you put rocks into machines, you close the machines, there's nothing really interesting to watch, you get little bits of data, and then you get an aha moment, like, oh, there's a real change in the carbon across these rocks, and it really tells us something about the atmosphere. So, as a filmmaker, you're always trying hard to make your films visual, and you're always trying to get to those aha moments quickly.
Mm-hmm. And for visualizing that, I can see that with the asteroid impact, right? This is something catastrophic and instantaneous that's easy to visualize. How do you think about visualizing processes that happen over thousands or tens of thousands of years?
Well, time-lapse photography? No, but I think in the Permian, the asteroid impact was almost instantaneous. But the volcanic eruptions, still 60,000 years, it seems like a long time. I know in geologic time it's nothing, but it still seems like a long time. Today, I think what's so hard to get our mind around is that it's hard to put together all the pieces of evidence, but like you fly over Yellowstone and you see, forest after forest that's gone up above the tree line, and you realize, okay, the temperature's changed 2 degrees here. 2 degrees, and it's allowing a beetle that's always lived here not to get killed off and to do this kind of devastation. So I think for me to step back and to try to get a sense in so many different ways, the stress, the interesting thing about the past mass extinctions is that rapid global climate change was the unifying theme in all of them. And today, we have, it's the first time ever we've had one species driving the extinction of other species, destroying habitats, overfishing, overhunting, and then we have the added stress of climate change. So, it's always a challenge to visualize a film.
Mm-hmm. And when you are thinking about visualizing or telling the story, who is the audience that you have in mind? I think for myself, I watch these kinds of documentaries. My kids who are 4 and 7 will also sit down and watch them. And as I looked at the film, I realized just how much science is underneath what's presented here that's really back it up. I could teach a whole course to give you enough background to that. So how do you think about that audience? Do you have a person in mind who's sort of your idealized?
I'm thinking about the average television viewer. This was on the Smithsonian Channel.
Yeah.
And if a word that was too scientific crept into the script, it would be quickly marked out by the executives. Get that word out of there. So, you know, you're trying to make it. I mean, the challenge is you know, I know our funder feels like people can handle more information, and science programs are getting dumbed down, and they wanted to have a certain level of science, and you try to simplify it and make it accessible to everybody.
And so thinking more broadly then, what is the limiting factor, the resources for producing these kinds of films? I remember in our conversations earlier you mentioned that you left a lot of material on the cutting room floor that you know, at least it sounded to me, could make another, you know, fascinating story.
It could have been a 2-hour film.
Yeah.
And you know, so there's so much that's crammed in, and there's so much you have to leave out. And the hardest thing is, what do you leave out? I mean, just when I was with you, I love, for instance, you were looking at, first of all, you kind of determined how much carbon was probably released during the Siberian eruptions. You want to tell the audience?
Right. So, yeah, how to tell it quickly. So we were looking at these changes in carbon isotope ratios, and we knew how much the amount of carbon-13 versus carbon-12 had changed. The problem is that we didn't know if it was a little bit of carbon that had lots and lots of carbon-12 in it, or a lot of carbon that had only a bit of carbon-12 in it.
Getting very technical.
Right. Yeah. So if we think about the, you know, thinking about your bathtub, right? You think about carbon isotopes as being the temperature of your bath water, right? If you want to make it warmer, you can put in a little water that's boiling hot, or you can put in a lot of water that's a bit warmer than the water in your tub, right? And either way, you end up with the same average temperature. And so that's what we're trying to figure out is a lot of carbon would change the climate. A little bit of carbon wouldn't change the climate as much. And so it turned out that the carbon by itself, you don't know the answer. And so we had to go in and measure the calcium. So we're measuring limestones, which are made of calcium carbonate. So it's a calcium, a carbon, and some oxygen in there. And by looking at the isotopes of calcium as well, we were ultimately able to calculate how much carbon was released. And it turns out to be, you know, probably at least twice as much as would be released if we burned all of the fossil fuels that are available to us today. It could be as much as 10 times as much of that for the end Permian. And so these were, you know, sort of staggering numbers. When you dump that much carbon in, if you take 50 trillion tons of carbon and turn it all into carbon dioxide. So this would have been mostly carbon and limestones and coals that those Siberian lavas were burning their way through. If that all went into the atmosphere at once, you'd end up with something like 30,000 ppm CO2 in the atmosphere as opposed to 400 ppm today, right? Yeah. So about 100 times what we have today. And that would make the planet extremely warm.
So when you ran it through these climate models, how hot do we think the temperatures were getting right after this extinction?
Right, so the data we have at the end of the Permian indicate about almost 20 degree Fahrenheit warming in the tropics, or 10 degrees Celsius. And this could have led to continental interior temperatures that might have been on the order of 60 degrees Celsius, which I think would be about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And these are temperatures that most animals can't live at permanently. Right. They can survive briefly. I mean, you know, we could go into a room that's 140 Fahrenheit, probably for a minute or two, but you wouldn't want to spend much time in there.
One of the things that I would have loved to include in the film was you telling me you began to realize what the ocean looked like after the extinction. Yeah. You called it slime world.
Right. Yeah. And so a lot of you know, I talked a bit about the chemistry in this film. In fact, most of my time and interest is devoted more toward the paleontology, and so. When we were looking at the end Permian extinction, the rocks that you looked at were more deeper water deposits. And so you saw those ammonite fossils, and then they're all gone after the Permian extinction. In shallow water, where we were working in another part of South China, we were looking at ancient reef deposits. And so you could really see deposits that would have been equivalents to the Great Barrier Reef today. And immediately on top of them are deposits that are made up of bacterial mats on the seafloor turned into rock. So this really would have been green slime sitting on the seafloor, and the reefs are gone. And so it's not just that the diversity is gone, but in fact the entire structure of the reef itself is gone. All of the individual organisms from all of those species are gone. And that, you know, the real challenge when we look at those data sets that I presented before the film, we knew even back in the 1960s and 1970s that a lot of diversity was lost over some 6 or 7 million year window. And what's amazing about going out to look at the rocks is that it turns out that you can put your fingernail on the spot where all of the diversity was lost, meaning the time window for these losses of diversity is extremely short. And this makes a lot of sense. When we think about biology, if we change the environment, if we do it slowly, organisms have a chance to evolve. And if they don't have a chance to evolve, they may at least have a chance to change their behaviors or the way in which they develop. The faster we change the environment, the less opportunity the organisms have to adapt to that.
So I think the amazing thing for me is I realize the world has been a lot hotter than it is today. There's been far more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there is today. But what's kind of frightening about today is the rate of change. Things are changing in a few hundred years that took tens of thousands of years in these past mass extinctions. And so it's really hard for a lot of animals to adapt that fast.
Yeah, I think that the rate of change is certainly very fast. Of course, the rate of change at the end of the Cretaceous would have been enormously fast. I think the thing that's really different and that strikes me in the film is that, and I think that the film did a nice job of balancing these two things, is that one thing that's going on today is the climate change. But I think the other thing that was very clear in the film is that direct human impact through hunting, through fishing, through land use is actually, right now, the biggest threat that most species face. And so, to me, that actually seems like a hopeful message, and maybe something that's worth emphasizing in Tony Barnowski's message is that if it were climate change alone, or if climate change were the primary threat that most species faced, we would actually be in a boatload of trouble. Because, as I mentioned before the film, it takes 100 or 200,000 years to get that carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere. And so once we burn our fossil fuels, we're committing to having very high PCO2, high carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, very high temperatures for as long as we can foresee, right? Long beyond any of the societies that we live in today. In the case where direct human activity is what's threatening most species, then a change in human behavior can have almost immediate impact, right? And that came up in the case of the population size of the grizzly bears. It comes up in the conservation of mammals in Africa, for example. And so I think that the fact that human activity is the largest threat we face at the moment in terms of extinction is good news, because it means that when we change our behaviors, we have an opportunity to very quickly allow populations to respond to that. Adding climate change on top of that, though, is potentially makes recovery much, much harder.
Well, should we, does anyone here have any questions? Should we open it up to questions?
I think we should.
Yeah.
And of course, we can't see any of you, so
now we can.
I believe the organizers are going to be coming around too.
Are we going back to Malthus? Are we going back to Malthus and the population? Is that where we're headed? Is that what we need to do?
Well, you would answer that?
Do we need to do it? I sure hope not. I suspect that human population size is going to respond over timescales of generations, largely through changes in birth rates, right? And that's a lot of what we see today, is that the human population growth is slowing down because birth rates in developed nations are slowing down. And so, I think that human behavior can change the population without violent deaths or deaths through famine. We look back through human history, right? In fact, we live in one of the safest ages that there's ever been on this planet for people, right? Fewer people die violent deaths at the hands of other people today than they ever have in human history. And so I'm actually very optimistic on that front, that the time scale over which we'll adjust will be fast enough and largely happen through birth rates as opposed to through some sort of violent
I think the bigger
death.
worry is that so many people today want the same standard of living that we have in this country, which is incredibly wasteful. And that's going to be hard for the planet to sustain.
Yeah.
Next question over here.
I'm curious about the specifics of change, like when you talk about human behavior or even population growth. But what about the urbanity of the world and cities becoming more and more popular? What can we do from an infrastructural standpoint to change our behavior that would accelerate, this recovery or this reversal of fortune?
I guess my take would be that from a conservation standpoint, urban environments are probably actually, I would guess, in many cases better than non-urban because the people are concentrated in a much smaller part of the land surface, which leaves potentially more of the land surface open to other organisms, other animals. I would think the big challenge would be that feeding 9 or 10 billion people means that all that land we're not living on needs to be farmed, right? And so figuring out how we create farming landscapes that are also useful landscapes to wild animals, I would think would be one of the major challenges on that front.
Tony Bernofsky, the last scientist in the film, wrote a book called Dodging Extinction, which he actually tries to take on the things we can do to try to avert this next extinction. One, if we all become vegetarian, we're not going to have as big a carbon footprint, and we'll maybe be able to feed the growing number of people, because we're going to go to probably 10 billion people by mid-century, by the end of the century. But the other thing is just we have a chance right now to still try to save a lot of the species on the planet by protecting their habitat, connecting their habitats. I mean, there's still time. We're going to lose a fair number. We'll probably lose elephants in 10 years, but it's not a done deal.
Next question over here.
I understand that the the Alvarez hypothesis is largely been accepted by the public and many scientists. But what since you study the Siberian traps, what's your thoughts on the Deccan Trap eruptions that occurred at 66 million years ago?
Yeah, the Deccan Traps certainly were erupting at the time of the end Cretaceous extinction. The coincidence of the extinction of species with very well resolved records with the actual impact event is statistically extremely well established, and so it's certainly possible that the Deccan Traps predisposed the world to being more sensitive to this asteroid impact. My personal suspicion is that no matter what was happening on the planet, if you have that asteroid impact, you have an extinction more or less on the scale of the end of the Cretaceous. One idea that was put forth very recently, just in the last few weeks in Science magazine, is that there may have been an acceleration of Deccan volcanism in the immediate aftermath of the impact and potentially triggered by it. Right? The impact would have created enormously powerful seismic waves, and so exactly what effect they would have had on the Deccan Traps, I think, is still an area that isn't settled. But this idea that the impact may have influenced the amount of volcanism in the Deccan Traps is certainly going to be one that will be explored for the next few years.
In the Badlands, they wondered if the dinosaurs were already on their way out. If the environment was so stressed, they were going extinct. And they actually didn't find any difference between the number of dinosaurs at the bottom of the formation all the way up until the asteroid hit. So at least in that one area, they could not say dinosaurs were going extinct before the asteroid hit.
Next question over here.
Both of you surfaced a lot of trends that were very interesting, clarifying not only the troughs, but the peaks, where it seemed like leading up to this time, there's been almost an all-time high of diversity. And I'm wondering, maybe as we head off some of the changes we might bring, what do you learn from that as to factors that can cause it to go up?
Yeah, so it does appear that diversity on Earth today is as high as it's ever been, which is great news, right? That's a nice point to be starting from. One of the very interesting things that we see in the fossil record is that, especially in terms of ecosystem structure, the recovery from mass extinctions actually appears to stimulate the discovery of new ecological types that were not in ecosystems prior to the mass extinction events. And so if your concern is diversity, if you're essentially viewing Earth as a Martian, right, and looking down and saying, what's good for diversity on Earth, if I want to wait around 100 million years, a mass extinction event might actually be very good news. If your concern is, say, the next decade or the next century or the next million years, mass extinction event is not good news at all. So what we see is that broadly diversity has been increasing over geological time. There are more and more animal species over time. A little bit of that is probably due to the fact that it's easier to sample the rock record as we get toward the present, and it's a little bit easier to distinguish species, partly because we know more about living species, and partly because the fossils are often preserved in material that's not consolidated into rock yet, so it's just easier to get the fossils back out. So there's a little bit of that, but the general trend toward increasing diversity seems to be a real one, and it seems to be stimulated in part by extinction events. So one would hope that if you come back 100 million years from now, that there will be even more animal diversity on the planet than there is today. What we'd hate to see is that dip that lasts 10 million years and starts right when human society develops.
And I think Tony Barnofsky would say that if we don't change the trajectory we're on right now, that in 200 to 300 years, 75% of the animals that you look around and see in the world today will be gone. I mean, that's what the numbers are saying. So it doesn't mean that's the end of life on Earth, but I think we're headed towards a crisis point if things keep going on this same trend.
Okay, next question's over here. To sort of stem off from that, so like I'm really passionate about this, and I've had this event on my calendar for weeks, but a lot of the people who hold the purse strings might not necessarily have had this event on their calendar. And so my question is how, we're at this crisis point or rapidly approaching this crisis point. How do we get people to care? I mean, this is a cool event, this is a free event, and we haven't even filled this auditorium. So how do we get people to care, and how do we get that change to happen that we need to have happen? I know that, a small group of concerned citizens can change the world, but how do we get that small group to be bigger, and how do we get people to actually really care about this?
I wish I knew the answer. I found the Republican debates incredibly discouraging in the inability to acknowledge what's happening to the climate and the impact on the world. But I really don't know the answer to that. What I do feel like is that all of the problems, we have the technology and the ingenuity to solve them. We have the ability to feed the world. We have the ability to reduce our carbon footprint. We can save animals. There's a huge amount we could do getting the political will and getting people to actually understand. I mean, my younger son said to me, "We're doomed." And I'm like, "No, we're not." And he's like, "What can we do?" And so, I was like rattling off things from Tony Barnofsky's book of the things he could do, like cut your electrical consumption 25%, don't eat endangered species, vote for people that care about these issues. I mean, there are things that can be done. I don't really know how to make people care. I wish I did. I mean, one of the reasons we tried to make this film was we thought if we could show you it's happened in the past and really present the evidence, then it really makes the case that it can happen again. And in fact, it looks like it's happening again.
Yeah, I think that it's important to keep in mind, right, that a large fraction of Earth's population, right, lives in conditions where they're worried about tomorrow and not about biodiversity 100 years from now or even 10 years from now. And so I think that in some ways, one of the concepts that's coming in part out of my ecology colleagues at Stanford is this idea of ecosystem services. And it's if you want to look at it, instead of taking an altruistic view that diversity is intrinsically good, essentially they're arguing that diversity is economically good for you. And I think that if we want mass action on that, that's probably the arguments that are ultimately going to be the most effective, is to show people that conserving diversity is good for you. It's good for you in terms of providing fresh, clean drinking water, in terms of avoiding flooding, avoiding catastrophic storms, in terms of preventing the spread of tropical diseases, right? In California, for example, we're starting to get populations of more tropical mosquitoes that at least potentially can carry things like dengue fever. None of us want that. Nobody anywhere in the world wants dengue fever. And so I think that there are a lot of ways in which it doesn't need to look like an argument about, about making sacrifices in order to preserve diversity, but rather that a lot of the things that we do that end up conserving diversity are actually good for almost everybody. And so, So I think that that's going to be the key. If we want mass action on that, we need people to to see it as something that's going to immediately benefit themselves. If we don't do it that way, then it's going to be those of us who have the luxury of having our material needs met easily all the time who can then step back and say we should also be conserving diversity. But that's not a majority of the people in this country, and it's not, sadly, not a majority of the people in this country, sadly, not a majority of the people on the planet.
Next question over here.
What was the cause for the other 3 mass extinctions? Is there conclusions?
Yeah, so let's see. So going from oldest to youngest, let's say, the Ordovician extinction appears to be largely related to a major glaciation event, though there may also have been changes in the amount of oxygen in seawater. The Devonian and Permian extinctions seem to be related to climate warming, decreases in the amount of oxygen in seawater, ocean acidification. The end Triassic mass extinction looks very similar to the end Permian in terms of even having another large flood basalt province that's erupting at the same time. And then the end Cretaceous has this giant impact event that doesn't seem to have any real counterpart with any of these other events. It does have this volcanic province that came up in one of the earlier questions that was erupting at the same time as well.
Okay, we have the next question over here.
You just answered it. I have heard in various cultures that there was the Great Flood, and so I wondered if anybody had found that was one of the cases.
No.
I actually have a question while I have the mic over here. A lot of these extinction animals, we're talking about macroscopic scale. I mean, even the tiny little ones are still macroscopic. Do we know anything about the bacteria that existed millions of years ago or even today, and how any of the extinctions may have affected bacteria, if that is included in the 50% or 75% of all life?
Yeah, so bacteria are tough because they're very small and they don't have hard shells, so they don't preserve in the fossil record very often. When they do, they don't have a lot of different morphologies, and the morphology doesn't tell you much about what species you're looking at. But it does turn out that some of the organic molecules that they produce are preserved in rocks, right? The oil that we burn to heat our houses and the gasoline we drive to run our cars is made up of these kinds of molecules. And so some of those can actually tell us something about what's going on. At the end of the Permian, these kinds of molecules have actually been very useful. One thing that they've shown us is that bacteria in general became more important after the extinction event, whereas eukaryotic cells, so cells with nuclei, which include a lot of the algae in the oceans as well as animals and plants, became less important. So it looks like after the end Permian, broadly speaking, there were a lot of bacteria. That doesn't mean there were lots of species, but it means at least some of the species were doing very well. There are a few molecules that actually tell us about certain groups. So there's one kind of molecule that is used for photosynthesis. So it's actually the molecule that takes in the photon to get energy from the light. And it's only used by bacteria that photosynthesize where there's no oxygen. And so this is one important piece of evidence that we have areas of the ocean that are very shallow enough that light is penetrating, and there's no oxygen in that water. And so that's been an important part of understanding what the conditions were after the end Permian extinction. So in terms of diversity of bacteria, we don't know a whole lot. Most people suspect that there are probably not big effects on the diversity of bacteria. We have to actually go much farther back in the geological record to find events that probably had a big effect on bacteria. And so if you go back to the Archeans, you go back to the interval between, say, 3.8 billion years ago and 2.5 billion years ago, especially between 3.8 and 3 billion years ago, there were some very, very large impact events that would put the end Cretaceous to shame. And in those events, they would have evaporated substantial fractions of seawater. And so then you're getting temperatures that would affect a lot of microscopic life. And so it's possible during those kinds of events that there may have been large effects on the bacterial life as well. So if animals were around then, it would have been very bad news. The planet is probably a little bit safer than it was when it was forming, and there were early on, and there were still a lot of large objects in the solar system waiting to hit us.
Next question here.
Sarah, I saw this film the last time you showed it here in December.
Mm-hmm.
And so is this just the second time, the only time since then, or are you showing it every other day all over the country?
No, this was broadcast last November. And it's now being streamed online for free. And the Museum of Science, someone at that screening asked me if I would come and do this screening. So the film has been out for about 9 months.
Well, what I'm interested in is the new element in the sixth extinction underway is the human element, right?
Yes.
So we have a lot of talk about biodiversity, but what's happening to humans in as far as diversity goes is just the opposite. Everything I see is about mass communications, mass opinion molding instantly, sound bites taking over from literature, and everything about the culture of the humans in the planet. The new element is going directly in the opposite direction of diversity. Does anybody agree?
What do you think?
I think I respectfully disagree on that. I think that certainly, so we're talking about two different things here, right? We're talking about cultural diversity versus genetic, right? When we talk about species, we're talking about genetic diversity. When we talk about people and communication, we're really talking about cultural diversity. And so certainly there are aspects of that, right? That lots of people on the planet from all kinds of different places have contact with one another. On the other hand, we're educating a much larger fraction of the human population than we did in the past. And so there are many more people with much more knowledge than we had previously, which I think is a very, very good thing. They still have very different experiences. One of the things I think that Sarah's film did so nicely was showing us how solving these geological problems is really a globe-trotting exercise. And one of the things I find fascinating in terms of doing that is just how different every country is that I go to and how different the people are. And so, but they know enough about each other not to fear each other and not to hate each other immediately, right? Which is a nice thing. And so my personal take on it is I think that, there's certainly negative aspects to this, right? But that by and large, I think the fact that we're educating so many more people and that so many more people have access either through video or through tweets or whatever form of communication, they have access to the thoughts of people all over the world. And I think that that's certainly a good thing.
Facebook.
And Facebook.
Okay, the next question's over here.
So this film does a wonderful job of walking us, the audience, through the unraveling of these two scientific mysteries, and then presents the third scenario, the sixth extinction, as a question of what can we do to address this process that's already underway. But I wondered, for both of you, what are the questions that you still have on this subject? Jonathan, in your work, what are you focused on, and what are the mysteries of mass extinctions that aren't solved yet? And Sarah, what are the questions that you as a filmmaker still had after you had put together this story?
Yeah, so I think in terms of what I don't understand, it actually comes to one of the questions that Sarah and I were discussing on the way over here, which is I think the way we tell the stories about mass extinction and the easiest way to conceptualize them for many of us, certainly for me, is sort of direct death in response to some environmental stress, right? Too hot, too little food, too cold, too little oxygen. What's much harder to figure out and reconstruct is how secondary extinctions might happen. So if a few species die because it's too hot or there's too little oxygen, how many of the species extinctions that we're seeing are cascades that aren't directly related to the environmental change but are secondary effects of some other extinctions? And that, I think, we have very little handle on at this point. And very little understanding of, does that vary from one extinction event to another? Is it unimportant at the end Cretaceous, but very important at the end Permian, or vice versa? I don't feel like we understand that terribly well at all yet. In terms of telling the stories.
You know, I think one of the frustrations that I had was this was just an hour, and we really couldn't even talk at all about what to do going forward, the things that we could do. That's really another film. And, you know, I guess the big question in my mind is, are we going to sit back and watch this train wreck happen? And I feel like we see super droughts, you know, super storms. We're looking at all these refugees in Europe, and I'm realizing soon we're going to have environmental refugees. So, you know, when I sometimes try to think about what film I might do next, it's the question is what would be another way to try to address this issue in a different way. I think a lot of films now are coming out recently.
This is going to be our last question up here.
So what would you say to all those people who said, oh, it was the coldest winter on record, there's no such thing as climate change?
Yeah. So, you know, the weather varies from day to day, right? And the, you know, the regional climate varies from place to place. And so it's certainly possible for certain parts of the Earth to have a very cold winter in any given year. What we understand now from satellites is we can measure the temperature of the whole planet, right? And when we measure the temperature of the whole planet, it's very clear that year on year, the average temperature of the entire planet is warming. And so this really becomes a question of long-term trends versus short-term variation. And so if you go from, say, winter to summer in Boston, on average, it goes from cold to warm. But you can have days in January that are warmer than days in May. It doesn't happen too often, but it does happen. And that's essentially the same thing that's going on at a different scale there, is that certain parts of the Earth will have cold winters. But if we ask, you know, what's the warmest February on record, right? You know, this year, what's the second warmest February on record? Last year, you know, when are the warmest years? You know, they're almost all in the last 15 years. And so the data that the planet is warmer now than it was in the past are exceedingly clear.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Sarah Holt and Jonathan Payne, for joining us tonight. I want to call attention to the biological murder mystery that we had on our hands. That was a great phrase in the movie. And what I want to admire the dedication of the scientists solving these mysteries, but concentrate on how to prevent future Jonathan Paynes and Alvarez's from trying to figure out what caused the end of mammals all of a sudden. So we can concentrate on potentially being vegetarian. We can certainly concentrate on responsible food sourcing and land use, remembering that a change in human behavior can have an enormous impact, to concentrate on economically beneficial arguments, and finally to vote well. Thank you very much, folks. Have a great night.